You're listening to The Money Hour with your host, Tina Mitchell, and co-host Keelan Harvey on Alternative Talk AM 1150. Now, back to the show with local mortgage experts Tina Mitchell and Keelan Harvey.
Welcome back to The Money Hour at 1150 AM KKNW, the Saturday, December 14th show. I am your host, Tina Mitchell.
And I'm your co-host, Keelan Harvey.
Your local mortgage experts. It is a great day to talk about money, and that's what the show is all about, how to make money, save money so you can have a better quality of life for you and your family. If you're listening to our show at a different time, you're listening to a rebroadcast. But we're here to answer any questions or connect you with the guests that we have on the show. You can call the show at 1-855-400-1150 or go online at themoneyhour.com. Again, that is 1-855-400-1150 or online at themoneyhour.com. In studio right now, we have Jon, Botten, and Megan Beers of Childhaven. Very excited to have you guys here for our entire show and a very special show at that.
Thanks
for having us.
Yeah, and a little bit about Jon. Born entrepreneur, Jon owned, operated, and sold 2 popular sub-sandwich restaurants before the age of 23. That's impressive. During the decade that followed, he exercised his creative and social service muscles as the owner of a video production and multimedia consulting company. Jon's company enabled dozens of nonprofits, schools, and churches to effectively communicate their impact and raise millions of dollars to expand their mission. In 1999, Children's Therapy Center contacted Jon to produce a fundraising video. During the production, he became deeply connected to the organization's mission of helping children and families reach their full potential. Members of CTC's staff and board encouraged him to apply for their open CEO position. Much to his surprise, he got the job. And in the 17 years that Jon led CTC, the organization transformed from a small therapy clinic to a largest and most comprehensive pediatric therapy and early intervention program in Washington. In 2016, Jon joined Childhaven as an interim CEO and later was offered the position permanently. Since joining Childhaven, Jon has been compassionate and innovated leader, driving Childhavens to strengthly expand and lead in pursuit of better services for more children and family. Jon was born, raised, and still lives in the shadow of Mount Si. Oh, beautiful Mount Si. Mm-hmm. In North Bend. He is a proud father of 4 sons and happy grandpa of 8-month-old twins. And now let's move over and I'll talk a little bit about Megan. Megan is passionate about building early childhood systems of care, as well as supporting the state's early childhood workforce and improving quality of care through reflective supervision and consultation. Megan is a licensed clinical psychologist. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in early childhood mental health in Brown Medical School, has a rich background leading program design and implementation, as well as training staff in both early learning and mental health contexts. Megan came to Childhaven from Wellspring Family Services, where she was the Senior Director of Early Childhood Services and led the integration of infant early childhood mental health and trauma-informed care across Wellspring's program. Megan is the Director of Programs at Childhaven, and in the 10 months she's been with the organization, she has implemented new programs such as Flourish, which specializes in intensive wrap-around care, as well as leading the efforts to bring relational health models to all Childhaven's programs. Megan is Washington native and lives in the Philly Ridge neighborhood with 2 school-age boys.
You guys are such rock stars. Mm-hmm. I'm like in awe.
That's why they're here.
Yeah, and rock stars for such a fantastic organization. So we're so happy to have you guys here. We're going to start with you, Jon. Tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, yourself and kind of your position and how this all turned into Childhaven.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as Tina just eloquently read, I have been passionate commitment to early learning, early intervention for my whole career. Through most of the 90s, I had a video production company, and we specialized in production work for local nonprofits that specialized in serving kids and families. And I was really exposed to a lot of different wonderful organizations that this community is lucky to have. But I did fall in love with the mission of Children's Therapy Center and was fortunate to work there for 17 years. And we were a strong partner of Childhaven when I was at CTC. And so when the opportunity presented itself to come to Childhaven, it was a huge honor. It's a 110-year-old organization, a true legacy organization in this community. And so it's a privilege to be leading it right now.
Oh, so awesome. And Megan, what about you? A little bit more about yourself and what brought you to Childhaven and your passion around the organization?
Yeah. Well, I'm a therapist by training and have spent a lot of my career working in early childhood and with kids and families who've experienced a lot of adversity. But where my passion really lies is taking that kind of out into the community, whether that's childcare, early learning, schools, pediatrics, wherever kids live, learn, and play. And Childhaven is really leading that work in our community. So I'm thrilled to be there right now and be a part of this big organizational shift that I think is going to have dramatic impacts on the health of little ones in our community.
That is beautiful.
So cool. Getting out there and sharing all that knowledge with the community. That's fantastic. Can you share a little bit about Childhaven in 110 years, did you say, John?
Yeah.
That's an old organization right there. Can you tell us a little bit about their history?
Yeah, it's one of the oldest organizations in Washington State. It was founded in 1909 by Reverend Mark Matthews, and it was actually originally called Seattle Day Nursery. And then in the mid-'70s, it kind of reinvented itself. We call that period Childhaven 2.0. It's where it really started to focus its work on kids and families who had experienced a wide range of trauma, abuse, and neglect. And the executive director then was a gentleman named Pat Gogarty, and he was pretty open in the community about some of his personal experiences, and he recognized a need in the community at that point to really kind of focus the organization and on young kids who had experienced a wide range of adversity. We're calling kind of the new incarnation of Childhaven 3.0 because, as you can imagine, the community needs have changed a lot since the mid-'70s, and even though we live in one of the wealthiest communities in the nation, by every indicator of community health, and particularly with young kids, things are not improving. So we took a really hard look at kind of what are the needs in the communities and what gaps is Childhaven uniquely qualified to fill. And so we're kind of reinventing this 110-year-old organization right now, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and I love that. Reinvention is so important, and especially when you look out to the community and see where the areas are not changing and making the impact that you really want to see. What a great thing that Childhaven is bringing that on. And I know there's a lot of really exciting and new things that are coming up, initiatives for 2020. So why is it important for Childhaven to pivot again?
Yeah, well, I think, just to build on what John's saying, the need's bigger than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And I think also just to highlight that the science has changed a lot. So we've learned a lot and are learning more every day, and particularly about the brain science, about how we help young kids and families. And so Childhaven, because of its long history and kind of position in the community, I think is really well situated to take the message out there and touch other systems, really kind of be a leader in the voice around how do we address this problem as a community that's impacting so many things that we all care about.
Yeah, and I love that within the spirit of change, with the advancement in science and really being able to see more that you couldn't see before, and now readjusting to adapt to how to make the biggest impact that you can. Such a great thing.
And I'm curious, like on our side of things, Seattle's taken off, right? I mean, I was born and raised here, so we saw this tech boom, and then all of a sudden this expansion, and then you have these six-figure jobs coming out right and left, and it's affected everything in Seattle. So a lot of changes seem like they've happened very quickly. I'm curious how that's kind of your guys' perspective with Childhaven and some of the gaps that are needing to be filled now with, and I don't even know, I'm assuming that's a factor on that end of things as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you look at the statistics, you would assume that everybody is benefiting from what you just described, and unfortunately, that's not the case. And so, for example, just kind of going off the top of my head, like there's more kids who are not ready for kindergarten than has ever been the case. There are more kids who are homeless than has ever been the case. the health gap between children of color and white children is growing more than it ever has.
Wow.
Teen suicide is at a 30-year high. And so kind of by the indicators that we look for communities improving, particularly it's most at risk and vulnerable, we're actually not really doing all that well as a community. And we believe we've got to do better.
I guess that was part of what I'm alluding to as well, is that we've left a lot of people behind in this thing. There's this huge affordable housing gap, and we've seen a homeless issue in Seattle that was almost borderline crisis. That's been a pretty heavy topic that's come out quite a bit. So I could see how there can be some issues involved with that.
That's certainly the most visible one. What's often not as visible is what's happened to our youngest kids. Those kids that we kind of specialize as kids under the age of 6, and those kids who are experiencing mental health issues, or their parents who are experiencing addiction or their own mental health issues. And it's certainly not as visible as homelessness, but it often leads to homelessness.
Yeah. So let's talk about the need in the community that Childhaven fills.
Yeah, I think really what it comes down to is that there are a lot of kids and families in our community facing a lot of adversity.
Yeah.
And even though that's, a lot of experts now are calling that the biggest public health crisis of our time, that's something that actually we don't talk a lot about as a community. So I think that Childhaven fills a number of needs, certainly providing a lot of direct care to kids and families. And then we also, I think, are filling a need of taking this out there and elevating the conversation and really saying, all the things that we care about as a community, whether that's mental health, whether that's, school outcomes for kids, whether it's homelessness, all aspects of well-being are really connected to what we experience as little ones. And so how do we wrap around children and families? And Childhaven's really leading that work and partnering with others in that work in our community.
Yeah.
London's going to be 4 in February, and I was just thinking below 6, it's so love that girl with all my heart to think about some adversities that some of these kids go through at that younger age is shocking to me. I'm upset if she goes to school without socks on, and some of these kids and kids are resilient, and the things that they can kind of deal with, and some of these, it warms my heart what you guys do. What do you guys, what are adverse childhood experiences in your guys, or ACEs as you guys call it? What are some of those that you guys experience?
Yeah. So the term ACEs comes from a study actually that happened, the first work on ACEs happened about 30 years ago actually, through a collaboration with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And what they were really looking at was essentially how does this set of 10 negative things that can happen to any of us as young kids, whether that's living in a household with a caregiver that's struggling with mental illness, or living in a household where a caregiver is struggling with substance use, exposure to abuse and neglect, other things. How do those things impact well-being, really? And when that research came out, I think there were a lot of things that were surprising about it. A couple that stood out was that ACEs are extraordinarily common. So even when this first study happened, they're looking at a relatively low-risk group of folks with employer-sponsored health insurance, right? By all indicators, you wouldn't necessarily expect a lot of trauma. And about 2/3 of that group had experienced at least one ACE.
Wow.
So really just the first piece is just, this is everyone, right? I think we often think of trauma as something that's happening to other people, and recognizing that actually this is impacting all of our communities. And then the other thing that was most surprising was, I think, when this research first came out, there was an expectation that, of course, if you experience tough stuff when you're young, that would be connected to later mental health struggles. But what was maybe more surprising was all the other aspects of well-being that adversity is related to. So things like heart disease and cancer, all these other indicators of lifelong health and well-being really all come back to kind of what we've experienced in the first 5 years of life in particular.
And that makes sense, because all that trauma starts that stress in the body, which then causes all of these other things to stem from that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So on that note, we're going to go ahead and take a short break, but we're going to stay here for the entire show with our representatives that are here from Childhaven. So coming up next, we have Jon Botten and Megan Beers representing Childhaven right here at 1150 AM KKNW after this short break.
You're listening to The Money Hour with your host, Tina Mitchell, and co-host Keelan Harvey on Alternative Talk AM 1150. Now, back to the show with local mortgage experts Tina Mitchell and Keelan Harvey.
Welcome back to the Money Hour on 1150 AM KKNW, the Saturday, December 14th show. I was waiting for some little words there with our Christmas music.
Christmas music's throwing you off today. I love it.
Love it. I am Tina Mitchell, your host.
And I'm Keelan Harvey, your co-host.
We're your local mortgage experts. We're here to help you build a strong financial blueprint 1 week and one show at a time. If you're hearing our show at a different time or day, you are listening to a rebroadcast, but we're here to connect you with the guests that we have on the show. You can call the show at 1-855-400-1150. Again, that's 1-855-400-1150 or online at themoneyhour.com. In studio right now, we have two representatives from Childhaven, Jon Botten and Megan Beers. And we were just kind of talking about childhood adversity and experiences and what comes from that. So let's talk, extend that a little bit and talk about the impact of childhood trauma and adversity.
Yeah. You know, the piece that comes to mind first is just this recognition that I don't know that we talk about a lot, which is this idea that I think sometimes we don't appreciate the impact of our really earliest experiences. One of the experts in this work talks about the brain may not remember, but the body does. And that's really what the science shows us, that the impact of adversity, particularly in the first 5 years of life, it's an impact on how our brains are built and how our stress systems are built. And that's really why it has such long-reaching effects on health and well-being, because the way our brains are built from the ground up, based entirely on the experiences that we have, the back and forth between the biology and experience, particularly in the first 3 years. And so those experiences in those first 3 years, and particularly adverse experiences, have a disproportionate impact on our lifelong health in ways that we can change the trajectory in big ways in those years that are much harder to do later on.
Well, that's why when you're going through therapy and counseling, it's always going back to your childhood to deal with the traumas that you've gone through so that you can really embrace those in the fullest, take the lessons from it, and then be able to push out the bad stuff that came from that, right?
Absolutely. And that's why really, at Childhaven, we exist to really drive change in those early childhood years, and particularly impact the grown-ups that support all of our youngest children, and so that we can set the stage and build healthy brains and bodies from the get-go, through the relationships that young kids have with the important and grown-ups in their lives.
It's shocking to me how it manifests into their health, specifically, like at that young age, how that mental, whatever that might be, comes out in actual physical health at some point. That's crazy. I don't know.
And I think bottling it up and not having the support, if you don't, like an organization like Childhood, and not having a way to address and deal and have that support, then it's just bottling up and sticking there, and eventually it's going to come out in some fashion. Correct?
Exactly. And, I think the brain, the sort of mind-body disconnect that we have kind of in the way we think about it is really that the body doesn't make a distinction, right, in the same way that we do. And so basically what it comes down to is our stress systems are designed to kind of manage little bursts of stress kind of going up and down. And when kids are living in stressful environments day in and day out, their brains are developing kind of in a soup of stress hormones, and that just impacts how the systems are set up that is very hard to shift later down the road.
No pressure. Jeez Louise. I'm just...
Well, that's why we have Childhaven, because so they can help them through that process.
Of London, I'm like, I gotta be very careful. She can get sick.
Yes, you do.
She's pretty blessed. So obviously this, impacts society, and there's other implications of this to society as a whole, childhood trauma and adversity. What is your guys' thoughts and perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, the studies are clear. The research is clear that the financial impact, and I know all your listeners are here to learn about money and the community, and the financial impact of adverse childhood experiences, according to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is $585 billion per year. And so the question really isn't, are we going to pay? We're already paying. Yeah. So the Childhaven's value proposition is you can invest now in the root causes and maybe prevent those downstream problems, or you can pay a lot more later in terms of fixing the problems that weren't addressed in the beginning.
So let's talk about the what the evidence say and the best way to prevent and address childhood trauma and adversity.
Yeah, so the evidence is pretty, we actually have decades of evidence kind of how best to buffer the impacts of adversity. And it really comes down to something, I would say, simple to understand and actually pretty challenging to implement, which is that it's about the relationships that young kids are surrounded by. So the best buffer for little brains experiencing adversity is the presence of as many safe, stable, and nurturing relationships as we can muster. And the more relationships that are around to buffer adversity that kids are going through, the better their outcomes are. And whether that could be a relationship with a parent or other home-based provider, but it can also be a relationship with a teacher or a mentor or a grandma. So really any adult that can kind of help navigate through the adversity that kids are experiencing. And that's really what Childhaven's all about, is how do we create systems both naturally within our communities, but also within the other places that kids spend a lot of time. How do we support the relational health, as we talk about it, of the young kids and families in our community.
One of the luminaries in our field is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bruce Perry, and he has this great quote that I love. It says, "Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love." And it's like we can throw a lot of services at kids and families, but if they don't have those strong bonds, those relationships, it may not have the impact. And so we're really focusing all of our work. We have a lot of amazing services and a lot of incredible service providers, but the connecting tissue of all of it is forming strong relationships with the kids, that the big people in the little people's lives.
Yeah, and when I went and had a tour of Childhaven, thank you very much for that opportunity, and saw all the different classrooms, and it was just amazing in the different groups and age brackets that you have and the different things in each of the classrooms. But the one that touched me the most was the babies, and because we all have heard the studies about the importance of touch and holding, and if you're in a family, I know you talk about supporting the caregivers and parents, because a lot of these are being raised by caregivers or in the foster system. And, in a stressful environment where there's trauma, a lot of times that holding, or even if there is holding, it's coming from a stressful place. And so that's coming onto the children. And so just seeing what you're doing, especially for the babies, there was a real beautiful thing. So thank you for that opportunity.
And it's fantastic. It comes down to love. That's a beautiful thing in relationships, which it makes a lot of sense to me. How do we do that? How can we as people help our community and get out there and show this love and build on these relationships that make such a great impact for our youth?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way we've been talking about it at Childhaven is about using an all-in approach, which is borrowed from a great researcher in this field, David Willis. And the idea is really that actually there's a lot of places where kids interact, right? Kids don't spend, blessedly, I'm a therapist by training, so I can say negative things about therapists. The kids don't spend most of their time with therapists, right? So what we have to do to build kids' health and well-being is actually be all in, right? And as a community, build an understanding of adversity and how it shows up for kids, and then also how do we build relationships with kids who are struggling. And so what that means for us, I think the other piece of what the research shows is that we have to take this information to the places where kids are, right? Yeah. We're never going to solve this problem in therapy sessions and 50-minute therapy sessions. We need that. That's an incredibly important service. But to take an example, Childhaven is doing really important work with the kids with the most intense needs in early learning environments. So we've got classrooms on site where we have small ratios and a lot of embedded supports, Tina, like you described, seeing in the classrooms. And that's a critical service. At the same time, we know that there are children who've experienced adversity in almost every classroom in our city and our county and our state. And so how do we both maintain that really important intensive service, but also, for example, provide an understanding, support all of our childcare providers in understanding how do we support a kid when we know they're going through something hard at home, and that's going to show up in the classroom. What do we do with the baby who we know has recently gone through a transition in caregivers? Because Childhaven intersect with all those kids directly, but we
Yes.
can support other community providers to do that.
Yeah, and we've talked about who you serve, and I believe it's critically important when you have a mission to have a very, not a target market, but a perfect market. What is the perfect market that you are targeting that you can best serve, and that you serve 0 to 6? And so talk a little bit about that and why that is your perfect market.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my first answer as a sort of researcher and therapist by training is that's where we have the greatest impact.
Yes.
That we know again and again that that there's a disconnect between the science and where our investments are as a society, right? We know we have the greatest impact when we intervene in the first 3 years of life, and most of our mental health investments are much later on. And so I think Childhaven's uniquely poised to really serve that market. Anything you would add, John?
No, I'm going to set you up with another question, actually,
Okay.
though. Yeah. I think part of our work is recognizing that there's only so much good we can do for the kids and families we serve if we're not adequately supporting the helpers. So how do we help the helpers with, there's a term that's used in our field, is kind of how do we take a trauma-informed approach to the work we do and then kind of spread that throughout. So Megan, could you talk a little about how we help the helpers and your philosophy around that?
Yeah, I think it's a really under recognized piece, which is that we have a lot of folks in our community doing this important work with all kids and families of all kinds, and we don't support that workforce actually very well as a community. And so helping the helpers and taking an approach to recognizing actually that many of us who do this work, in the same way that trauma is very common throughout our community, many of us who do this work have experienced adversity ourselves, which is a great value, makes us compassionate in the work, but it can also be a really challenging piece. So how do we kind of build a system of support so that people can sustain in the work and have the greatest impact on kids and families?
Yeah, and I love that in your new focus, really putting a lot of extra attention on the caregivers of the children. And it's not just about supporting the children, but it's providing the resources and the support that the caregivers and the parents need.
Absolutely. You know, I think and I think one thing that's a truth that I experience every day in this work, which is that it's a lot easier to have compassion, honestly, for a very young child who's experiencing adversity and showing up and having a lot of big behaviors and big emotions and really struggling. It's harder, honestly, for all of us to have the same compassion for an adult who has had those experiences as a child and is now showing up as an adult, as a grown-up with a lot of big behaviors and big emotions. And that's really the core of the trauma-informed approach, is instead of, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you behaving that way? What happened? And how can I understand what you've experienced and connect with you, understanding that?
Yeah.
I got a curveball for you. So why don't we hear about this more? Like...
That is a great question.
I love that question.
Yeah, like why it seems like it's under the surface, right? And why is it like that?
Yeah, that's the kind of the $1 million question. And often when I'm in spaces talking about this work, everybody's expectation is that it's new research, and when they hear that, oh no, the ACEs study first came out 30 years ago, it's pretty shocking. I can muse on some of my thoughts, and John can share his too. I think that it's really hard for us to talk about, honestly, in the same way. It's different than seatbelts or talking about good nutrition or other things. I think that the recognition just that this is so common, this kind of, traumatic experiences and adversity is so common in all communities, across all racial groups, across all income levels, I think is hard for us to reckon with and hard for us to talk about. That's I think a unique role that Childhaven can play to really kind of raise this, wave this flag and say, no, this is all of us, and we only solve it by as a community.
Yeah. There's a quote, I love quoting other people because it makes me sound smart, but there's Dr. Robert Block, he's the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, he says, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today.
Yeah.
Yet nobody even realizes it.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it feels like an accountability thing. Like nobody, it takes a lot of courage to stand up and establish that an innocent child is struggling. Mm-hmm. And good on you guys for everything that you do. It couldn't be a better cause, period, to help our babies literally at their core. So good on you guys for that.
Which is the future.
For sure.
Yeah. So coming up next, we're going to be here for the remaining of the show with our representatives from Childhaven, Jon, Botten, and Megan Beers, right here on 1150 AM KKNW after this short break.
You're listening to The Money Hour with your host, Tina Mitchell, and co-host Keelan Harvey on Alternative Talk AM 1150. Now, back to the show with local mortgage experts Tina Mitchell and Keelan Harvey.
Welcome back to The Money Hour on 1150 AM KKNW, the Saturday, December 14th show. I am your host, Tina Mitchell.
And I am your co-host, Keelan Harvey.
We are your local Christmas mortgage experts. We bring in studio each week the best of the best experts in our local market on everything money. We're here to help you in today's economy. If you're hearing our show at a different time or day, you are listening to a rebroadcast. We're here to connect you with the guests that we have on the show today. You can call the show at 1-855-400-1150. Again, that's 1-855-400-1150 or online at themoneyhour.com. And in studio, back in studio for the entire show, we have our representatives from Childhaven, Jon Botten and Megan Beers. So I'd like to kind of go in and talk a little bit about how you put relational health concept into practice.
Yeah, sure. So relational health is a pretty simple concept. I think putting it into practice can be a little bit trickier, but basically we're really just talking about how all the grown-ups around our little ones engage and are able to support kids, particularly in times of stress. I think where it becomes a little more complicated is that what we know and what the data shows us is that how each of us is able to do that as adults is really dependent on what we've experienced as kids ourselves. So all of the struggles that we're talking about around trauma and adversity are often intergenerational struggles. And so often caregivers need quite a bit of support to navigate through tough times and building relationships with their children through tough times. And so we put that into practice in a lot of different ways. But I think to come back to kind of the all-in concept, one is equipping providers with an understanding of what to look for and when. So pediatricians, always one of my favorite examples. So we've, pediatricians are kind of a first point of contact for families with very young kids. You're there when the baby's a week old and 2 weeks old and 6 weeks old.
Can't hide it from the doctor.
And yet we don't actually provide a lot of support to those. We kind of as a system don't provide a lot of support to those providers for what to look for and how to kind of identify when a parent may be struggling with connection with their young baby and how to support that in really simple ways. And so really, as we're growing as an organization, those are the kinds of things we're looking to, is how do we both provide direct supports where we're meeting weekly or monthly with parents and their young children to support this relationship using evidence-based models, models that we know work from the science, but also how do we support those other providers that are already interacting with kids and families to pick up on when there are concerns and then do really simple things to build those relationships and to help parents understand the impact they're having, particularly in those early months and years.
Yeah.
I hope this is an appropriate question, but we're talking about like these we're talking about ACEs. Mm-hmm. What are a couple ACEs you could kind of throw out at us here? Things that, it always makes me wonder if 2/3 of kids around you, is having some of these issues, some adverse, and kind of what can we do about it? I asked you like 5 questions there. We'll start with ACEs and kind of some adverse, some adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah. So when the original study came out, that there were 10 ACEs that they looked at, and they were pretty individual, family focused. So things that you might, I think, typically think of when you think of trauma, like the exposure to emotional or physical abuse or neglect, living in a home that's very stressful for a variety of reasons. I think one of the things that folks may not think of, which kind of subsequent research has actually talked about as adverse childhood environments, would be all the other things that kind of exist outside of a family's home that can create the kind of adversity that many of the kids in our community are being exposed to. So things like poverty, living in extreme poverty, living in a situation where you're exposed to discrimination on a day-to-day basis because of institutional racism, other community exposure to community violence. So things that happen both in neighborhoods as well as things that happen in homes. And I think one of the things that's a misnomer is often when people think of childhood trauma and adversity, they think of one big bad thing happening to kids. And in reality, what's actually much more disruptive, we obviously don't want one big bad thing to happen to kids either.
Yeah.
But what's most disruptive for brain development and well-being is chronic stress.
All of those little consistent things.
Consistent things,
Yes.
because that's what creates that, what I call the soup of stress hormones in the body that has the biggest impact on well-being.
Yeah, I always talk in business in my coaching program. It's about the small decisions that you make every single day that's going to have a ripple effect. It's not that one big thing. It's all the small things that lead up to that big thing. And it's interesting to hear you say it's not always necessarily within the family and what's happening underneath the roof of that house, but it also can be externally what's happening outside of the home because of the poverty situation that they're in. So yeah, that's interesting. So the reason I wanted to, Keelan wanted to, for us to bring you into the show is to really showcase Childhaven being the longest around. 110 years is just amazing, and really to provide a place for our listeners to have an easy way to contribute and to give back, and something that we represented on the show. So what is the best way that our listeners can get involved with Childhaven, Jon?
Well, certainly going to our website. We try and keep our website updated with opportunities for people to plug in a variety of ways, and that's simply childhaven.org. And you could email Megan or myself directly, and my email is Jon, JONB, @childhaven.org, and we would love to meet with anybody and everybody. One of the things that we've really been focusing on lately is partnerships. We recognize that we can't kind of have the community level impact that we want alone, no matter how big we get. And so we have to form strong partnerships with government entities, with other providers, with the healthcare system. And so we're spending a good percentage of our time out meeting with others and say, how can we partner with you in order to kind of launch this movement about average childhood experiences and relational health being the antidote to the greatest health threat impacting our society.
What would you do, I should say, if you're on the outside looking in and you can see some adverse situation happening with a child? What would you say you could take action to help somebody directly or maybe indirectly?
That's a really good question.
Sorry, I'm drilling you today. I'm sorry. I was thinking about that, that 2/3 thing really stuck in my brain.
Yeah, it's a big daunting number. And actually, to come back to, I will answer your question, but to come back to your other question about why we're not talking about it, why more people don't know about it, I do wonder if it's daunting, right? It's like it's a big problem to solve, and I think that it's overwhelming, even though we do have good solutions out there. The first thing that comes to mind is actually not it is science-based. It is a science-based answer, but it's not going to sound like a very science-based answer, which is, I think, that part of the sort of individual action in the solution is engaging with folks when we think that there's things like that going on. And I think there's so much stigma and so much hiding, right, around when around struggle, and particularly around struggle within families and in parenting. And I think that approaching with curiosity and a desire to help and a desire to connect, as opposed to a judgment or a shame around the struggle, I really think is the first piece. Just a question of, gosh, like it seems like this, you're having a hard time. How can I help? And leaning in instead of leaning out. Because I think societally we lean out when families are struggling.
Yeah, and what a great place for caregivers and parents that are in these challenging situations to be able to have a safe place, a great place for their kids to go, have 2 strong meals, right? And so they're there from what time to what time?
Yeah, but it's about a 6-hour school day. So yeah.
And because at that age, from 0 to 6, they're, until they get in kindergarten, they're not in school. And so they don't have a place to really be able to release and do the things that they need to do. Because I think a lot of the stress can come from that as well, is when you have any tragedy or challenges, adversities that are happening in the home, not being able to have some time away from the kids to where you can take care of the things that you need to take care of. Childhaven provides that, and then everything that is offered to the children while they're there is really great.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most exciting developments in the last year at Childhaven is that for the children that are in the program for that 6 hours a day and are getting that great classroom support, sort of parallel to that, each of the caregivers are paired up with what we call a wraparound team. So a team of Childhaven staff that are supporting them in their goals, whether that's moving forward with employment goal or housing or school. So those things are happening. We're building the child's capacity as well as the parent's capacity at the same time. And what we know from the science is that that's really the best way to help kids over the long run, is supporting parents and kids at the same time.
Yeah, another thing that was interesting when I went in on my tour was really having a environment for them that it's theirs. I mean, they have the same place that they're putting their stuff. They have the same teachers. They've got the same activities that they go through. So if they don't have a stable home environment, at least for these 6 hours that they're at Childhaven, they have a stable place that is their place, right?
For sure. Yeah,
and
that
I think
consistency.
is important, that consistency. Yeah, I'd love to go back to not an exciting comment that was made, but was surprising, in that we're at the highest level of teen suicide for 30 years. Why? What do you think is changing in our community that is causing that?
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of wondering, I think, right now amongst kind of folks in the field about outcomes like that getting worse, and the word that comes to mind is disconnection, and how kind of this is many people that speak about this much more eloquently than I do, but just this idea that sort of in a variety of ways, right, we're moving kind of collectively away from community and connection and mutual support, and more towards isolation. And I think that ultimately, like a statistic like the rise in teen suicide is many are supposing that it's arising kind of from some of those broader cultural shifts.
Makes sense.
And that being paralleled with kind of a pulling back on the safety net. We have fewer services kind of as a community. We're not supporting kind of mental, social, emotional, and behavioral health in the same ways that we have previously. So I think those two together are a pretty dangerous combination.
Yes.
You make me think of virtually, right? The social media and all that. You can disconnect and feel connected when you're connected to a world that's not even real. Like, we all, as great as it looks on Facebook, we're all having challenges in life. It's not what everybody appears. We're not eating steak dinners, every night and all that. And it makes me wonder, I enjoy the social part of my life and growing up, and that's how we were forced to communicate, and it's sad to see that go away. So I don't know if that plays a part in it, but I sure see it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wonder about that too. And I think, really the relational health concept, we talk about it most at Childhaven with very young ones, but it applies throughout the lifespan, right? Like we all thrive with a sense of belonging and connection. And I do wonder about things like social media and other sort of broad brush societal shifts that are pulling us away from that. And I think a lot as a mental health professional about how do we kind of collectively turn the tide on that. Because again, it's another problem that's not going to be solved with therapists. It's going to be solved collectively in our community.
Yes. So as we're wrapping up our time here, I would love for you to share one thing that you'd like to leave with our audience. Megan, let's start with you.
I guess because I always have a hard time with one thing, I'll do two parts of one thing.
Okay. We'll give you two parts.
One is just that I hope that folks will continue the conversation. I think that's a really natural next step, is just talk about this. Google ACEs, check out some of the TED Talks, and then also kind of hold relationships as the core. This is a big, scary problem, and it's impacting lots of big things, but we really do have the research. We do know how to make change if we invest in it as a community.
Yeah, well said. John, one or two things?
I think I'll go another direction slightly and kind of double down on what I said earlier is the community does not invest in this work nearly to the degree it does, but we're willing to pay for it on the back end. And so 50% of our budget comes from the generosity of the people who invest in our mission and the kids and families we serve. We've got really ambitious growth needs because the community needs us to grow. And so we're certainly going to be doing a lot of outreach and asking the community to invest greater in this work, either through us or others who are partnering with us. And again, you can pay now, or we can pay a lot more down the road. And hopefully people will recognize the wisdom of investing now.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of you for coming in and for everything that you do for our young children and helping them to really be able to have a successful life, because I do believe that when you're dealing with adversity, that adversity can actually have a real positive spin in the person that you are and the difference that you can make in the world because of that adversity you went through. But you have to have the support and the tools which Childhaven provides at such a crucial time for the children. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Mm-hmm. And if you want more information on Childhaven, you can call the show at 1-855-400-1150. Again, that's 1-855-400-1150, or go online at themoneyhour.com. And this is your host, Tina Mitchell.
And your co-host, Keelan Harvey.
Signing off for the day, but we'll be back next Saturday right here at 11:50 a.m. KKNW, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.